More than 200 operators died in just the first 5 days of combat on Iwo Jima. The average lifespan after activating the flamethrower was 2 to 4 minutes. Only 18 flamethrower operators survived until the end of the battle, many with severe burns, auditory trauma, and nervous breakdowns. Of the 380 flamethrower operators sent to Iwo Jima, only 18 left the island alive. They were described as the best, and at the same time, the worst, weapon the US Marines had there. But their story is much more horrible than it seems, and now you will understand why. The Japanese developed a specific obsession with eliminating flamethrower operators. They knew it was one of the few weapons that could destroy their underground fortifications, so they actively ordered that any Japanese soldier who spotted an operator should prioritize him, even under crossfire. Furthermore, the Japanese developed specific techniques to lure them into traps. For example, they pretended to abandon a casemate, allowing the Marines to approach. When a flamethrower operator arrived, they used side tunnels to come out behind him, killing him at point-blank range before the rest of the platoon realized the trick. Many of these tunnels had hidden exits in bushes or in artificial craters for exactly that purpose. However, this is only one detail that explains the real situation. The strategic importance of Iwo Jima. During World War II, the Pacific Front was marked by iconic battles such as Guadalcanal and Okinawa. However, between these confrontations, there was a campaign that stood out for its singular character and the tactical brutality involved: the Battle for Iwo Jima. The island, with just over 20 square kilometers, was located at a remote point in the Pacific Ocean, positioned between the Mariana Islands and Japanese territory. At first glance, it seemed only an elevation of volcanic rock without great value, but in 1945, it assumed colossal military importance. The reason was purely strategic. The United States Air Force operated B-29 bombers from the Marianas, aiming to hit the industrial heart of Japan. However, these flights passed directly over Iwo Jima, which made the island a privileged point for the Japanese to install radars and station interceptor fighters. This threatened American air missions, compromising both the effectiveness of the attacks and the crew's safety. Capturing Iwo Jima would solve several problems for the Allies. With the island under American control, it would be possible to install an intermediate airbase there, allowing fighters to escort the bombers to their targets, something that would drastically increase mission success rates. In addition, it would serve as an emergency landing point for damaged planes on the return, saving thousands of lives. The island would also facilitate launches of more destructive attacks, as it would reduce the distance to Japan. On the Japanese side, the tactical value of the island was equally recognized. High command knew an American offensive was imminent, but unlike previous strategies that involved direct confrontations on the beaches, this time they decided to innovate. Instead of repeating the mistakes made at Tarawa, Saipan, and Peleliu, where superficial defenses were obliterated by naval bombardment even before the Allied landing, the Japanese commanders adopted an underground approach. The new tactic involved a complex network of hidden fortifications under the ground. Combining bunkers, tunnels, and camouflaged positions, the Japanese hoped to delay the American advance and inflict as many losses as possible. The fight on Iwo Jima would not be just a dispute for territory, but a demonstration of what Japan was willing to do to slow defeat. The island would cease to be just a geographic point. It would become a symbol of extreme sacrifice and the brutality of a war fought to the last man. The flamethrower was not originally a central weapon in the United States' arsenal. Unlike tanks and M1 Garand rifles, it was considered a niche resource. American doctrine before Iwo Jima saw the flamethrower as a combat engineering tool, used to clear caves, clear brush, or drive soldiers out of very specific positions. The dreadful reality of combat on the Pacific Islands forced American command to reevaluate this view. At Iwo Jima, the flamethrower ceased to be a tool and became a protagonist. Generals soon understood that it was practically impossible to master the Japanese underground defenses without these weapons, so much so that specific units of assault flame teams were created, temporary detachments composed of 4 to 6 men trained exclusively to protect, escort, and resupply the primary operator. At the forefront of the Japanese defense on Iwo Jima was General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, a veteran commander who knew well the reality before him. He did not delude himself about the possibility of victory. His mission was not to triumph, but to cause the maximum losses to the Americans. His plan was simple, yet brutal, to transform every meter of the island into a deadly resistance field, forcing the United States to pay a high price for every advance. The hope was to buy time enough for the Japanese mainland to prepare for the expected final invasion. American intelligence estimated that there were a little more than 13,000 Japanese soldiers defending the island. That assessment was far from the truth. There were nearly 23,000 fighters spread across a sophisticated underground defensive system. The very nature of the island, composed of porous volcanic rock, allowed the construction of almost 20 kilometers of tunnels. It was a complete combat complex. There were hideouts, ammunition depots, artillery posts, command rooms, and multiple positions interconnected by corridors beneath the surface. Kuribayashi knew every rise and depression of that terrain. He had positioned his guns and machine guns in advance, aiming at the places where the Americans would likely attempt to land. The battlefield had been meticulously calculated to maximize crossfire and make any advance difficult. There was no fixed front line. The entire island was a web of ambushes, ready to envelop the enemy with fire from all sides. On the morning of February 19, 1945, the American operation began in the usual way. Warships and planes unleashed a massive bombardment on the island, believing they were weakening the enemy defenses. For days, Iwo Jima was pounded by tons of explosives. When the first Marine platoons touched ground, they expected to find only rubble and disorganized resistance. As they stepped onto the beach, they encountered treacherous terrain, a thick layer of black volcanic sand that sank underfoot. Vehicles bogged down easily, and digging for cover was almost impossible. The scene seemed too quiet. For nearly an hour, no shots were fired. The Marines, believing they had secured a calm start, began to advance slowly toward the hills. It was then that the real trap revealed itself. At the exact moment the beaches were crowded with American troops, Kuribayashi authorized the attack. A coordinated downpour of machine gun, mortar, and artillery fire erupted from hidden positions. It was as if the island itself had come to life and fired at the invaders. The ambush was devastating. Soldiers were trapped in the open, easy targets for Japanese precision fire. Even so, the Marines did not retreat. Meter by meter, under intense fire, they began to push their lines inland. A new weapon against hell. Only after that initial advance did the Americans begin to understand what they were dealing with. The Japanese defenses were not destroyed, they were hidden. Behind the barren appearance of the landscape lay a true hostile labyrinth, where every opening could hide a shooter or a grenade launcher. To deal with that, it would take more than courage. It would take fire, a lot of fire. The M2 flamethrowers produced a distinctive sound when in operation, a mix of whistling and a continuous roar, similar to an old jet engine. The Japanese learned to recognize that sound at a distance. Even without spotting the operator, they would fire in his direction with machine guns, mortars, or improvised grenades. In many cases, merely hearing the jet of fire was enough for a dozen camouflaged positions to immediately turn toward the target. Additionally, the operator's silhouette was unmistakable. The barrel-shaped fuel tanks, connected by tubes to the soldier's back, made him look clumsy and slow, easy prey in the open. Few imagine the logistical drama of operating this weapon. The thickened gasoline used in the M2 flamethrowers was mixed with napalm type B, a viscous compound based on synthetic rubber that adhered to practically any surface. skin included, and burned for up to 10 seconds at 1200 degrees Celsius. The refill drums had to be carried on foot by assistants, often under enemy fire. There was no safe quick reload system. The operator needed to find cover if he survived, remove the equipment from his back, connect hoses, manually refill the 3 tanks, and only then resume combat. This could take between 3 and 5 minutes, time enough for any front line to have moved or collapsed. On Iwo Jima, it was not enough to destroy a bunker to defeat it. Many positions that seemed neutralized came back to life when the Marines advanced. Japanese troops, hidden in tunnels connected beneath the ground, reappeared from the rear, opening fire from locations that had already been considered safe. It was like fighting an invisible enemy that moved under the earth. The Americans could not define a clear front line. Everything was chaos, confusing, lethal. Among the greatest obstacles were the casemates, reinforced structures made of concrete, well camouflaged, and with machine guns pointed in every possible angle. Many were so well hidden that one passed by them without noticing, until the bullets began to fly. Destroying those positions was a risky mission. Soldiers had to advance under constant fire, often crawling between rocks and craters, until they got close enough to throw explosives. Even then, the result was uncertain. The casemates had curved or zigzag interiors, which limited the effect of explosions. It was not uncommon for the Japanese to survive and resume firing minutes later. That was when flamethrowers proved vital. They allowed attacking the interior of those shelters without the need for direct entry. The liquid flames penetrated the corridors and eliminated resistance almost immediately. The operators of those weapons, however, ran extreme danger. They carried fuel on their backs and were the enemy's preferred targets. Contrary to what many think, flamethrower operators were not conventional volunteers. Often they were selected by physical strength, endurance, agility, and psychological criteria. They trained with real equipment, and part of the training included withstanding the extreme heat radiated by the jet itself, which could heat the operator's body up to 70 degrees Celsius, even at short distance from the discharge. Exercises included marching with the equipment on inclined terrain, crawling under simulated fire, and emotional control under loud noise. But no training could prepare someone for what they would face on Iwo Jima, where the black, sandy terrain absorbed and reflected even more heat, drastically increasing thermal stress. In Iwo Jima, flamethrowers became almost indispensable, but those who operated them bore a mortal burden. To understand how desperate that role was, it is essential to understand how this weapon operated in practice. The model used by the Marines was the M2, a heavy and rudimentary device. It featured 2 reservoirs filled with a thick, flammable mixture of gasoline and a central cylinder of compressed nitrogen, whose function was to force the flammable liquid out. This mixture was expelled through a metal hose, equipped with an ignition mechanism, which could be electrical or chemical, responsible for igniting the jet. Despite its visual and psychological impact, the flamethrower had severe limitations. Its effective range was short, about 18 meters, and the total firing time was a mere 7 seconds. There was no room for waste. Each burst had to be short, precise, and lethal. It was necessary to get dangerously close to the target, open fire for a few seconds, and withdraw, all of this under extreme risk. The effect of a flamethrower was so devastating that enemy soldiers did everything to prevent its approach. It was enough to see the flames coming out for all the defenders' focus to turn to the operator. With a bulky, heavy backpack on his back, carrying more than 30 kilograms of flammable fuel, he became the most sought-after target on the battlefield. To protect him, the rest of the troop provided cover with suppressive fire. It was a race against time. Distract the Japanese shooters long enough for the operator to complete his mission and escape alive. But in an environment surrounded by fortified positions and hidden tunnels, success was as uncertain as survival itself. Testimonies from captured Japanese soldiers revealed something shocking. There was a deep emotional aspect to the hatred against flamethrower operators. They were seen not only as a threat, but as living demons. The samurai code of honor, adapted for imperial propaganda, preached that fair combat was fought with sword or shot, and that incinerating a man was an offense to the fighting spirit. A document found after the battle carried the phrase, "A man who brings fire on his back burns the soul of the sacred land. He must die first, even if he takes us with him." This fanaticism resulted in targeted suicide attacks. Several operators died from bayonets, hand grenades thrown with meter-precise accuracy, and even foot kamikaze soldiers, with explosives on their bodies, running toward the flamethrower. Survival tactics of the operators. A few veteran operators developed their own strategies to increase their chances of survival. One was to remain in absolute silence until a few meters from the enemy position and fire without warning. Another was to work in pairs. While one fired the flamethrower, the other shot with a submachine gun or covering rifle. In rare cases, operators hid the flamethrower with camouflage tarps or positioned it sideways to disguise the silhouette. But these strategies had limited effectiveness given the level of preparation of the Japanese defenders. The flamethrower against the island itself. Iwo Jima's unique geography turned the flamethrower into an even more dangerous weapon for the operator himself. The island's volcanic sand reached high temperatures under the sun, making movement with 30 kilograms on the back a constant thermal ordeal. The metal equipment heated to the point of causing burns even without contact with fire. Furthermore, the jets of flame projected into caves created micro-explosions of hot air, which could ricochet off rock walls, returning toward the operator like an infernal breath. There were documented cases of soldiers who fainted from the heat wave and were burned to death by the residual jet escaping from the barrel. The worst fear of all. Among the numerous dangers faced by the Marines on Iwo Jima, there was one that surpassed even the fear of death, being captured alive. And for the soldiers who carried flamethrowers on their backs, that possibility came with a fate almost always more cruel. These men were not seen as ordinary combatants. In the enemy's eyes, they were symbols of total destruction. Surrender was rarely an option. At best, a captured operator could expect a quick execution. But more commonly, there was something prolonged, a merciless revenge for the terror his weapon spread. A well-known account from the battle speaks of a Marine whose flamethrower failed at the worst possible moment, right in front of a cave. 2 Japanese soldiers surprised him, dragged him inside, and disappeared. The platoon could still hear his screams coming from inside the rock for 2 days. Unable to save him or even relieve his pain, all they could do was listen. And that was only one facet of the horror. The weapon itself was a constant risk for whoever carried it. One mistake, a gust of wind in the wrong direction or a failure in the ignition system, and the operator could be swallowed by the flames he was supposed to control. In addition, there was the psychological impact. Firing a flamethrower meant seeing, hearing, and even smelling the devastating results of your action, all up close. How burned survivors were treated. What happened when an operator survived a partial fire? In many cases, he was treated by field medical teams that did not have adequate resources. Because napalm stuck to the skin, the standard procedure was to remove the affected tissue with a scalpel without anesthesia, since the patient was frequently in shock or unconscious. Third-degree burns required amputations, improvised skin grafts using the tissue of dead soldiers, and, in some cases, even blood transfusions performed between comrades right on the battlefield. According to records from the Navy Medical Corps, flamethrower operators were 5 times more likely to require amputations than any other combatant on Iwo Jima. Some of the few survivors gave interviews in the following decades. One of them, veteran Jack Hurst, stated in 1972, "I still dream of the smell. It's not just burned flesh. It's something that sticks to the soul. I see the flames coming out of the tip, and I know exactly what I'm doing with it." They screamed. And I saw. There's no way to forget another, known only as Sergeant Wallace, confessed that he avoided lighting campfires until the end of his life. The mere sound of gas being released would cause him to panic. Sometimes, operators used a tactic called wet burst. They fired a few short jets without activating the igniter, basically soaking the target with fuel. Then they followed with a lit burst to set everything on fire at once. This increased the chance of completely neutralizing the bunker, preventing anyone from returning later. In confined spaces, the jet of flames immediately raised the temperature to over 1,000 degrees Celsius and consumed all the oxygen. Even if the soldiers inside were not directly hit by the fire, they had very little chance of surviving. Seeing a flamethrower in action on video is far from conveying the true impression of how loud and violent it really was. Even the operators were trained to take a long, deep breath before firing, since they could not breathe while the jet was active. Iwo Jima was the stage for the massive use of modified Sherman tanks with flamethrowers, known as Ronson tanks, or flame tanks. These vehicles carried flamethrowers mounted in place of the front machine gun, or even as the main armament, with a much greater range than the portable model, up to 150 meters in a straight line. The psychological impact was so brutal that many Japanese soldiers committed suicide inside the caves before the firejet reached them. In a report from the 4th Marine Division, we read, "The caves attacked by flame tanks often fill with smoke and silence before the fire reaches the bottom. The enemy is already dead or has killed himself." Foot flamethrower operators often advanced right behind the flaming tanks to ensure that smaller positions and lateral tunnels were cleared after the vehicle's action. In several situations, flamethrower teams acted together with soldiers carrying TNT explosives or demolition charges, known as satchel charges. The tactic was simple and terrifying. The flamethrower operator expelled fire at the cave entrance. While the fire was still burning, the second soldier threw or manually placed an explosive charge of 5 to 10 kilograms. The combination of hot air and explosion created an internal collapse and killed by pressure. These actions, repeated hundreds of times, permanently sealed many caves. It is estimated that about 2,000 Japanese soldiers were buried alive in operations like this. There were also reports of operators who died charred by their own equipment. In some cases, enemy bullets pierced the rear tanks and ignited the fuel. The result was a fireball up to 3 meters high, engulfing the operator's body, who barely had time to scream before dying burned in seconds. Even contact of the flamethrower with branches or irregular surfaces could make the fire jet ricochet at unpredictable angles toward the operator himself or his allies. For this reason, no one liked marching behind a flamethrower operator. Most operators who died did not scream, not out of bravery, but because the heat burned the airways before they could make a sound. A direct flamethrower jet at 2 meters distance could carbonize a human's head and torso in less than 4 seconds, literally drying the skin before death. Marines' accounts of witnessing these scenes describe the smell as burnt oil mixed with melted hair and charred leather. Few photos of dead flamethrower operators were published. The reason? Psychological impact. According to internal memorandums from the U.S. War Department, images of charred operator bodies were withheld by the censorship sector to avoid morale drops among recruits and families. In a note written in March 1945, a U.S. Army Signal Corps officer wrote, "Their bodies do not look human. They look like charcoal sculptures in twisted positions. Showing them to the public would be a devastating mistake." Many of these images only came to light decades later, through declassified archives. Some Japanese caves were specifically designed to reflect and redirect flamethrower fire. There were false entrances, short, curved tunnels that led to hollow chambers. When the flame jet was fired there, the fire accumulated burned oxygen, but did not hit the real enemy, hidden in adjacent compartments. After the operator withdrew, thinking he had cleared the position, the Japanese soldiers emerged from another tunnel. Amid the chaos, the Marines began to create improvised versions of the flamethrower. They used regular vehicle hoses, cut fuel drums, and even parts from downed planes to assemble rudimentary gasoline and phosphorus shooting systems. These homemade weapons had even shorter range, but served for quick attacks against caves and firing holes. It was common for a platoon to dig into the sand with shovels, assemble an improvised flamethrower, and use it a single time before abandoning it. The Japanese quickly learned to identify and ambush flamethrower operators. Some of the specific tactics included pre-marked crossfire paths. An operator who entered a certain corridor was immediately hit by shooters in elevated positions. Explosives tied to friction wires connected to the flamethrower's tank. The operator's own movement triggered the mechanism, exploding the fuel on his back. Reverse combustion traps. False trenches with gasoline planted in the ground, ignited by a Japanese spark or grenade when the American approached with the flamethrower. In a documented ambush by the 3rd Marine Division, 4 operators were killed in less than 60 seconds. Victims of synchronized fire from Japanese snipers whose sole mission was to kill men with tanks on their backs. Even with all these risks, flamethrowers were one of the few tools that truly worked in Iwo Jima. Still, with such high mortality rates, the Marines needed something that could carry this weapon into battle with a little more protection and capacity. That was when the tanks arrived. These were the modified Sherman flame tanks. Instead of a main cannon, they were equipped with a flamethrower system. On the outside, they looked like normal Shermans until they fired. They now carried about 1,100 liters of thickened fuel and could launch flames 3 times farther than the M2, up to about 90 meters. These flame tanks operated in coordination with infantry and regular tanks, but, like the handheld flamethrowers, as soon as they opened fire, the entire front line focused on them. And carrying hundreds of liters of fuel inside a metal box was not exactly something tank crews found appealing, as if they didn't already have enough risks. After the battle, the Americans found documents at the Japanese HQ in Iwo Jima with explicit instructions to identify and kill flamethrower operators, classifying them as targets of absolute priority. One excerpt read, "When you see the back of a demon with 3 tanks, know that he is the scourge of our people. Do not allow him to breathe." This demonstrates that the operators were not only a military threat, they were symbolic targets for the Japanese, representing the destruction of Kuribayashi's underground empire. Despite their decisive role, flamethrower operators were rarely honored with medals or recognition. Many did not even know each other's names, since the turnover was so high that every 2 days the operator of a platoon was replaced by another newly trained one, or died before that. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of the battle, a small group of veterans erected an unofficial plaque in memory of the operators. It read, "Those who carried hell on their backs and released it with their hands. May they never be forgotten." Japanese researchers who interviewed survivors of Iwo Jima after 1945 observed a curious pattern. Soldiers who faced flamethrowers developed a specific type of aversion to intense heat, even decades later. Some reported panic attacks on hot days or during hot baths. A report from the University of Tokyo, published in 1965, coined the term shakunetsu shogai, scorching heat disorder, describing symptoms of anxiety, excessive sweating, thermal hallucinations, and fainting. This disorder was directly linked to the memory of the continuous fire from American flamethrowers. Small pause. Unintended side effects. The use of flamethrowers also caused side effects among American soldiers themselves. Smoke asphyxiation. Soldiers advancing behind the flamethrower in poorly ventilated caves could faint due to the napalm smoke that accumulated. Thermal disorientation. In at least 38 recorded cases, Marines were mistaken for enemies and accidentally hit by flames from Sherman tanks when they appeared covered in soot or ashes from explosions. Secondary combustion. Fire spread by napalm could hit flammable equipment, ammunition, rations with solid alcohol, radios, creating unforeseen fires in the rear. Small pause. The lonely victory. Despite everything, flamethrower operators were decisive for the American victory at Iwo Jima. It is estimated that more than 30% of direct Japanese deaths were caused by flamethrowers, either by fire or by structural collapse after incineration. However, their memory remained on the margins. In official ceremonies, they were rarely honored directly. The image of the liberating soldier preferred the Marine with the flag, not the man with fire on his back. It was only from the 2000s onward that veterans associations began to highlight the vital and sacrificial role of these men. Help us keep this project alive here on YouTube by subscribing to the channel. Thanks for watching, God bless you all, and see you soon.